History has a convenient way of simplifying the truth. It prefers heroes who fit the mold, charismatic, authoritative, and, more often than not, male. For over half a century, the textbooks told us a singular, unwavering story about the discovery of the cause of Down syndrome. They told us it was the work of a genius, a man named Jérôme Lejeune, celebrated as the father of modern genetics, a man who dined with presidents and was on the path to sainthood. But this story is a lie. It is a carefully constructed myth built on the silence of a woman whose name was nearly erased from the record. To find the truth, we must peel back the layers of prestige and awards to reveal a cramped, underfunded laboratory in 1950s Paris where the real breakthrough happened, not under the gaze of the world, but in the quiet determination of a young researcher named Marthe Gautier. In the mid-1950s, the genetic cause of Down syndrome was one of medicine's greatest unsolved mysteries.
The prevailing theories were vague, blaming everything from maternal syphilis to alcoholism, but no one had looked deep enough to see the mechanism itself. Into this void stepped Marthe Gautier. She was not the established patriarch of a department. She was a brilliant young cardiologist who had just returned to France after a scholarship at Harvard, and she brought back something that no one else. The prevailing theories were vague, blaming everything from maternal syphilis to alcoholism, but no one had looked deep enough to see the mechanism itself. Into this void stepped Marthe Gautier. She was not the established patriarch of a department. She was a brilliant young cardiologist who had just returned to France after a scholarship at Harvard, and she brought back something that no one else in Paris possessed, a secret weapon. At Harvard, she had mastered the new and delicate art of cell culture, techniques to grow living cells outside the body. In the rigid, male-dominated hierarchy of French medicine, this was alien magic. When Gautier arrived at the Trousseau Hospital, she was given a designated role to work on rheumatic heart disease, but her mind was on a bigger puzzle. Raymond Turpin, the head of the unit, had long suspected a chromosomal link to Down syndrome, but had no way to prove it. He challenged the team, but the male researchers merely theorized. Gautier, however, knew how to look.
But knowing was one thing, doing was another. The conditions she worked in were primitive. There was no funding for her project, no budget for the expensive equipment she had used in Boston. Refusing to be stopped by bureaucracy, she took out a personal loan to buy glassware. To keep the cell cultures alive, she needed blood serum, so she used her own. She became her own test subject, her own financier, and her own lab manager. She even sourced a cockerel from a local farm to obtain plasma. It was guerrilla science, conducted in a repurposed space with a borrowed refrigerator. But her technique was flawless. She utilized a method of hypotonic shock, using distilled water to swell the cells until they burst open, spreading the chromosomes out so they could be counted individually. In May 1958, the moment of truth arrived. Alone in her makeshift lab, Marthe Gautier peered through an outdated microscope. She wasn't looking at a blurry mass of genetic material. She was looking at clarity.
She began to count the chromosomes of a patient with Down syndrome. 1, 2, 3. The medical dogma stated there should be 46, but Gautier counted 47. She checked again, and again. It was undeniable. She had found the extra chromosome 21. In that silent room, dusty and ignored by the establishment, a young woman had just solved a riddle that had baffled science for decades. She held the key to a medical revolution, unaware that the man she would trust with this key was already waiting in the wings, ready to claim it as his own.
Marthe Gautier had the discovery of the century on a glass slide, but she faced a mundane yet catastrophic technical hurdle. She could not capture it. Her microscope, a relic compared to the equipment she had used in the United States, lacked a camera. In the world of science,
If you cannot document your findings, they do not exist. You cannot publish a description. You need the image. This vulnerability became the crack through which her legacy would be stolen. Enter Jérôme Lejeune. At the time, Lejeune was a protege of Professor Turpin, a charismatic and ambitious researcher who was famously eager to make his mark. He was not a cell biologist. He did not know how to culture the tissue or prepare the slides. That was Gautier's domain. But he had access to a photographic microscope in another laboratory. Trusting him as a colleague and a friend, Gautier handed over her precious slides.
She believed he would simply act as a technician for this final step, taking the pictures that would validate her work. What happened next is a study in calculated silence. Lejeune took the slides and the samples, and then he vanished. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Gautier, busy with her clinical duties and trusting the collaborative process, waited for the photos. She did not know that while she was treating children with heart defects, Lejeune was traveling. In August 1958, he attended a genetics conference in Montreal. There, armed with the photos of the cells Gautier had grown, prepared, and shocked, he announced the discovery of the trisomy 21. He spoke of his research. He dazzled the international community. He did not mention that he hadn't prepared a single one of those slides. The betrayal was cemented in ink a few months later.
When the seminal paper was finally published in the French Academy of Sciences, the authorship line told a devastating story. The first name, the position of the primary discoverer, was Jérôme Lejeune. The last name, the position of the senior supervisor, was Raymond Turpin. And there, buried in the middle, was Marthe Gautier. To add insult to injury, her name was misspelled. In the blink of an eye, the architect of the experiment was demoted to an assistant. The scientific community, eager for a hero, embraced Lejeune. He was articulate, he was a man, and he fit the image of the great discoverer. He began to tour the world, giving lectures on his finding. Gautier was left in Paris, confused and sidelined. When she tried to assert her role, she was met with gaslighting. She was told that without Lejeune's statistical analysis and his photography, her work meant nothing. The narrative shifted rapidly. Lejeune was the genius who identified the cause. Gautier was merely the technician who followed instructions. It was a classic case of the Matilda effect, biased against acknowledging the achievements of women scientists, playing out in real time. The theft was so complete, so brazen, that for decades no one even thought to question it. Lejeune built an empire on that stolen slide, while Gautier returned to her work in pediatric cardiology, carrying the heavy burden of a truth that no one wanted to hear.
For the next 50 years, the lie didn't just survive, it flourished. Jérôme Lejeune became a global icon. He was showered with accolades, including the prestigious Kennedy Prize, and was celebrated as a staunch defender of life, using his scientific status to bolster his moral arguments. His foundation became a powerhouse, and the Catholic Church even began the process of his beatification. His name became synonymous with the discovery of trisomy 21. History books were written, statues were planned, and in every retelling, Marthe Gautier was either a footnote or entirely absent. Gautier, meanwhile, lived in the shadow of the giant she had unwittingly created. She focused on her patients, becoming a respected specialist in pediatric cardiology, but the injustice gnawed at her. It wasn't just about ego, it was about the erasure of reality.
She watched as Lejeune accepted credit for the hours she spent bleeding her own veins for serum, for the personal loans she took to buy glass, for the intellectual leap of bringing American techniques to a French lab. She was the architect of the house, yet the man who took a photo of the front door was given the deed. The silence finally broke in 2014. Marthe Gautier, then over 80 years old, was due to receive a grand prize from the French Federation of Human Genetics. It was meant to be her moment of vindication, a late-in-life correction of the historical record. She prepared a lecture detailing strictly the factual chronology of the discovery, the dates of her experiments, her notebooks, the reality of the lab conditions. But the guardians of the myth were watching. In a move that shocked the scientific community, the Jérôme Lejeune Foundation sent bailiffs to record her speech, threatening legal action if she defamed the late Lejeune.
The pressure was so intense that the organizers, terrified of a lawsuit, canceled her presentation at the last minute. It was a brutal attempt to silence an octogenarian woman, even half-century later. But this act of aggression backfired. The cancellation made headlines. It drew the eyes of the Ethics Committee of the French National Institute of Health and Medical Research. The Ethics Committee launched a thorough investigation. They dug into the archives, interviewing witnesses and reviewing the original 1950s documents. Their conclusion, published later that year, was damning and unequivocal. They found that while Lejeune had indeed helped promote the discovery, the technical and intellectual authorship belonged to Marthe Gautier. They stated clearly, the discovery of the extra chromosome must be attributed to Marthe Gautier. After 5 decades of erasure, the truth was finally stamped with an official seal. Jérôme Lejeune may have been the face of the discovery, but Marthe Gautier was its mind. Today, we tell her story not just to correct a footnote, but to remind ourselves of how easily history can be distorted by power and prejudice. Marthe Gautier passed away in 2022, but she died knowing that the world finally knew. She was not just a pair of hands in the background. She was the pioneer who saw what the world was hiding, and no amount of stolen glory can dim that light anymore.